In San Francisco, there has been a rush to rename 44 local schools that, used to be named after George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Paul Revere. They are now stricken from the public consciousness in the neighborhoods where they once were. And local politicians, Willie Brown, people like that, have taken over that prestigious entrance into higher education. Here to talk to us about that is a regular guest on our show, Pastor Eugene Park. He is associate pastor of True North Church in Palo Alto, California. He hosts a podcast, which we love, called Off the Pulpit. Gene, welcome back. How are you?
Hey, good to see you guys.
Yeah, always good to see you, Eugene. We are broadcasting at 101.5 Word FM, 96.5 FM, also 7:30 a.m. WPIT, and you can look at Eugene for yourself on Facebook Live right now.
Oh, I'm live?
Yes.
You are live, yeah.
Go on to Facebook, The Ride Home
You have your
with
blinds
John and
closed because you're in
Kathy.
sunny California.
I am.
Yeah.
Here, we're like, shrouded in the depth of despair of clouds and darkness. But that's a whole other story. You've got your own despair. It's a historical despair, Eugene.
Yeah. So I'm in Palo Alto, which is pretty close to San Francisco, and all things in the Bay Area kind of run out of San Francisco. It basically is a cultural center, and it's just interesting seeing this happen in my region. I think it's a great snapshot of what's going on, or what will go on in the American society as a whole, which kind of concerns me too, in a bigger meta level as a pastor.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's talk about exactly what happened. So John mentioned it at the beginning. There are major historical figures who have schools named after them in the San Francisco area, like Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson or Paul Revere, and George Washington, another, and there are many others. Anyway, in a conversation that apparently, and I'm reading from 3 different news sources, a conversation, the school board that lasted 5 seconds.
Yeah.
5 seconds. They decided to strike the names from these schools because they decided that these historical figures had morally come up wanting.
Yeah, and I actually watched that Zoom call or snippets of it, and it was just wild to see that it was a quick decision. And this is where I understand that certain figures do need a second look. I think history, it always clarifies with more time often, and there are certain sins that we need to reckon with as a nation.
Right.
But the fact that President Abraham Lincoln's name was cast out in 10 seconds, I think speaks a lot of what cancel culture demands from people, which I think is an impossible standard, that they seek perfection from historical figures, when in reality is we need to learn, especially as Christians, that to understand that human beings come with both sin and the goodness of God inside of them, and understanding that and seeking how to see them in that light, neither glorifying them as gods or canceling them as people that should be erased from history.
Right. And you can't place a man in a 21st century confines who has lived and worked and done all that in the 19th century confines.
Exactly. I do think that it is I think C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery often, to take what we see, more clearly from the present and apply it to the past. And I think the bigger worry, though, is how they used sources. If you look closely at some of these reports, they use Wikipedia for some of them, history.com, like random websites. And actually, there's a good article from a local paper that did a deeper dive, and some of them are just flat out wrong. And I think it just speaks to the confirmation bias that so much of the left, and I actually think both ends of political spectrums have, that we seek not truth, but confirmation of our instincts these days.
All right, so let me read just a couple of these inaccuracies. The citation provided, I'm reading an article by Joe Eskenazi.
Yeah.
And there are several really good articles. There's a great one in USA Today. This is, the source is Mission Local. But there's a great article in USA Today by Jonathan Zimmerman, and also a great one by Thomas Fuller in the New York Times. But let me go back to Joe Eskenazi. This is what he writes. The citation provided to justify the striking of Paul Revere's name from a K-8 school was a top 10 list from the History Channel. Can't even say it. The History Channel website. That article notes that Revere was court-martialed for alleged cowardice and insubordination following the disastrous Penobscot expedition against the British, 1779. During a back and forth and a renaming committee meeting, however, this ignominious Revolutionary War military defeat was somehow, as they've changed it, tied to the conquest of the Penobscot Indians, which was partially somehow attributed to Paul Revere. This is, as the writer says, a telephone game-like invention of fact and never happened. In reality, per the article from the History Channel website itself, Revere went back to silversmithing after the war and sired 16 children.
That should be enough for an award anyways from that fact.
But, don't we all admire him for it?
Yeah, but I think it just speaks to, man, there is such a hunger for vengeance and a disregard for truth in our current landscape. And I think as a church, elements of that have crept into the church discourse as well. And I think just as Christians, that's something that we, to what we hold to, need to speak out on if we do see that happening on a larger societal backdrop.
Let me read another. I'm sorry, John. Go ahead.
No, it's hard to respond to the mob because the mob is so huge. And of course, depending upon who's in power, they have absolute control. Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. And I think, even during President Trump's last months when he commissioned the 1776 Commission, I don't know if you guys were familiar with that.
Yes, we are. Yeah.
Even on the right, they included no historians in that committee, which is similar to this group. And I just think it just speaks to so much of how everything now is opinion based. And there's no regard for historical fact or truth or any of that matter. And it's just confirmation that you want from your own bias, which is a scary place to be in.
Yeah.
Right. We're talking to Eugene Park about what's going on in San Francisco with the renaming of schools. I want to go back to this article by Joe Eskenazi because he makes a good point here. He said, this is what you get when you perfunctorily cut and paste material from sources that would not be acceptable for a junior high school oral report and then misstate and misinterpret even that material. I mean, they've got lame material that they're interpreting badly. This could have been prevented, he writes, by the hiring of a 20-year-old intern fact checker of the sort that saved many prestigious magazine writers from ruin, or perhaps by consulting a historian who knows what he or she is talking about.
Yeah, hey, they could have hired me. I need the extra cash too.
See? And you were right there willing.
I was right there in the area as well. So if they're listening, I'm always free to help out here.
So, Eugene, it's just laziness, right? I mean, all of a sudden you're deciding historical fact based upon the History Channel website or Wikipedia. Both those sources, everybody knows. I mean, especially Wikipedia, that's an open source. So I don't care if you're vetted by Wikipedia or not as, one of those contributors, you could still have a bias and put in wrong information and people would nod their head and think that's the absolute truth. Yeah.
And, Wikipedia itself is such an interesting, I think, trend in our times that it's a community-based project to seek truth, which, I don't find any problem in that. But I think just even the notion of that it's kind of a new era that we're living in. And I really think I think you touched on it, John, that there is a sense of laziness. But I think more than that, I think both sides or groups or whatever you want, they're blinded by vengeance. I think they're right to see that history has its reckoning, especially American history at this point. But I mean, the Bible is clear. Vengeance is the Lord's. And I think when you think about it more deeply, it's because when you take vengeance into humanity's hands, it blinds us. It makes us ignore truth. It makes us make up truth, or it makes us look to history.com to find truth. All right. A History Channel, which makes great alien documentaries, but I'm not sure if it's a great historical finder these days.
So then by that measure, Willie Brown is a more perfect man than Abraham Lincoln.
You got to laugh out loud when you say that sentence.
Yeah, who knows? And, one of the things that actually said on the report is Abraham Lincoln was a pretty startling figure to cancel, correct?
Yeah.
And someone actually made the point that Malcolm X was included in one of the names, and someone mentioned in his past history, he had a history of being a pimp, something that, even in modern day, I think, liberal trends, that's not the right way to treat women. But they said, his future life kind of covered over that. And that just kind of shows that there's a huge cognitive dissonance going on where you when you play God, you don't even make sense yourself.
Yeah. Jeremiah Jeffries, who's the committee chair, was asked why they didn't include historians. Why didn't they bring people in to kind of, give their perspective? And he said, what would be the point?
What would be the point?
History's written and documented pretty well across the board. And so we don't need to belabor history in that regard. He said, we're not debating that. There's no point in debating history. Either it happened or it didn't, as historians have referenced in their own history. So I don't think there's a discussion about that. So it's a very straightforward conversation. So no need to bring historians into it.
Okay, so then, Eugene, if we're canceling actual historical fact, then what hope does the church have with the truth of the gospel? I mean, I can imagine what it's like to be a pastor in California and have to fight that uphill battle because, there must be people who are in your congregation who would nod their head and say, what's being done here is good and right and true.
Yeah, and I think this is where the church in America is in a trickier spot. That I think that we even hold to things like truth and objective truth, and that we hold that it's found in a book with objective facts. And I think a lot of that does come with actually speaking up during these times. Maybe even, if my kids aren't old enough, but if my kids were old enough in this district to show up in the meetings and to try and speak some truth into it, no matter the consequence, because I think that's what we're called to do as Christians in the areas that we live.
Yeah. Well, with a 5-second meeting, you better work awfully fast, Eugene.
Hey,
tell them to make their point and get out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still open to be their fact checker if they're listening. I could use extra cash, so please hit me up if you.
And maybe if someone hears that, they'll hire you at the History Channel.
I would love that job as well.
Eugene, always good to see you. Thanks for coming along today.
Yeah, same to you guys.
Eugene Park, Associate Pastor of True North Church, Palo Alto, California. His podcast is called Off the Pulpit.